All right. What is up, everybody? Welcome back to SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. It is Tuesday, June 8th, 2021. Thank you so much for joining the stream. If you are watching us live, no one's watching us live just yet. We'll wait for a few people to come in. But if you are watching the recording of this, thank you again so much for tuning in. This is a live Q&A style show where we answer your questions that you have about DFS, about SaberSim, about sports betting, whatever you guys want to talk about. We take questions in through our Slack channel. We take questions in through YouTube chat, and we take questions in through our support email and Twitter, wherever you guys want to ask questions, right? This is live for a reason. So I am going to do my best to answer some of the questions that we've got in the queue here today. But if you have follow-up questions, if something doesn't make a lot of sense to you, if you have some clarifying questions, please ask. That's the reason I'm live here with you. We want follow-up. We want to really dive deep into some of this stuff, make sure that you guys have a good understanding of what we're talking about. And if there's some conversation that takes place or some back and forth, even better, right? So that's the purpose of this show. This is also a daily show for a reason, right? So I say it every single day. I am not coming on here to tout. I am not coming on here to give you my favorite picks or anything like that. But we want to take advantage of the slates we have for today and use it as an example. We want to talk about big slates. We want to talk about, we got a big slate for MLB today. We want to talk about the slates we have on that day to fuel our conversation. So let's see. I mentioned if you have questions, right, pop them into Slack, pop them into YouTube chat. We'll get right to it. If you are watching the recording of this and want to get involved, if you are a SaberSim subscriber and are not in our Slack channel, email us, support@sabersim.com. We will get you in. I say it every single day. We've got a great community. There's really just awesome conversation, really about deep DFS strategy concepts going on in our Slack every single day. And that is kind of the home front for office hours here, where most of the questions come in. So shoot us an email if you want to get involved. And if you are watching these and you are not part of the SaberSim community, we have a free 7-day trial. You can come check us out. You can watch office hours. You can learn a little bit more about what we're doing here and get involved. So let's see a little bit more housekeeping, right? So we do these streams every day, 2 p.m. Eastern time. On Thursdays, that time is reserved for what we are calling a strategy session. We've done 2 of them already. 2 weeks ago, we did a sports betting strategy session. We had Max on talking a little sports betting strategy, how to start setting up your sports betting process, some advanced tips if you've already been sports betting for a while. And if you're just a DFS player and want to level up and learn a little bit more about how you can use Vegas signals and our sports betting add-on to influence your DFS process, that's a great video to watch. And last week we did NBA showdowns and short slates. So NBA playoffs are right in the middle of it right now. There are awesome NBA showdowns and short slates contests going on every single night with pretty big prize pools on both DraftKings and FanDuel. So if you are playing those showdowns and short slates every night like I am, you've got to go back and watch that. We had both Max and Danny on, some really great conversation about NBA short slate strategy. So I know a few folks in the NBA channel, it looks like, had some pretty decent nights last night. So pretty exciting stuff there. We also had a short MLB slate yesterday, and I had mentioned on stream yesterday that there were a lot of concepts that we talked about in that NBA video that are just true of smaller slates and showdowns for all sports. And then sure enough, it looks like Matt had a huge night, and a lot of our other users just had really nice nights on the MLB short slate yesterday. So I will take all of the credit for that, for mentioning that you could use some NBA concepts in MLB short slates as well. And anyone that wants to donate a portion of those winnings can just go ahead and do that for me, since I was so responsible for that lineup construction. So anyway, all jokes aside, this week, right, on Thursday, we'll have another strategy session. We are targeting an esports themed strategy session there for Thursday, right? So we've got League of Legends now is back into full gear, I believe. CSGO is also right in the middle of the season. I'm a little new to the esports scene, getting into it. I'm a big fan of watching a lot of League of Legends in particular, but I've never really played a lot of esports DFS. So we've got a couple members of the team that know a lot more about it than I do that I think will be joining us on Thursday to talk a little esports strategy. So that should be a lot of fun. And then next week, we've got the US Open tournament for golf. That starts obviously Thursday morning. So what we are planning on probably doing is moving our strategy session to Wednesday of next week and talking a little bit of golf strategy since we'll have a major tournament next week. Talk a little golf strategy, especially if you've never played DFS golf and you're playing a lot of NBA or baseball or whatever is in season for you, and you want to try your hands at a new sport. Major weeks are always a great time to jump in. The contests are enormous. The field is relatively soft because you have a lot of people that maybe typically don't play golf DFS and are just jumping in to get into some of those big contests. I think you also grab a lot of people that maybe are golf fans but don't know DFS as well and are playing DFS for golf for only that week. And I think that can be a pretty soft field. So I always get really excited for major weeks. We'll have a lot to talk about. I think we are targeting that for Wednesday of next week. So anyway, let's see here. There have been a bunch of questions that have come in over the last 24 hours. Thank you guys so much for everyone that is submitting questions here. We've got a ton to talk about today. I know there are a handful of questions in the Office Hours Slack already. We had some come in through support. So thank you if you are watching these recordings and emailing us questions to talk about on Office Hours or tweeting us. We had a couple come in through Twitter. Thank you so much for being a part of the stream. We have an hour here or about 54 minutes here left now that I've talked here for 6 minutes or so. And yesterday we were pushed right up against the finish line trying to get to everything. So I am just going to jump right into it and not waste anyone's time any longer here. And let's go ahead and get ourselves started. So I will pull up SaberSim. Let's see. Oh, I think I've got two windows open. I do. There we go. That should do it. Oh, just a minute here. Hang on. I had two windows up and now it's all. Huh. All right, we are back. Sorry about that. I clearly gave Firefox a little bit too much to handle there by trying to share my screen. And it said, "We quit. We're done. See you later." We're gonna crash ourselves and also crash all your other programs you're running. So anyway, we're back. SaberSim's up. Got a lot to get to. So let's just go ahead and get started. Let me pull up my first question here. Okay, so this question came in. I'm going to just go ahead and put the topic here. I don't have the full question. So this question came in from Zach on our support channels, and it is about custom projections and custom team totals. And what Zach said he was doing is going in and uploading his custom projections every day for a slate, and then also going in and tweaking his team totals around, and was curious on whether or not that was doing anything or was a good use of time. And that's a great question. Again, Zach, thank you for asking that. And I'm glad I have an opportunity to talk a little bit through this on stream. So the short answer here is that you're not going to be adding anything extra to your process there, right? So it's really kind of one or the other. So really what we are doing is the team totals that you see here that you can edit and move up and down are really a way to facilitate making editing your player projections a lot easier, right? So if we go in and we bump the Dodgers up to 6 runs, the reason we have this tool here is to just, it makes it a lot more intuitive for the user, right? It's not always clear if you're maybe very bullish on Dodgers, for example, exactly what the best thing to do to their projections necessarily is. Vegas odds obviously are all going to be, apart from like props and things like that, but Vegas odds are typically going to be for team totals. It's just a lot easier to do this. When you're doing this creates a custom projection for different players, right? So if we go in and we are already adding our own custom projections, so we can do that here. Let's go ahead. I'll do this using the table. Actually, let's use Walker Buehler. And let's say we're just bumping up his projection, right? So he gets bumped up to 25. You'll see here. We're not going to touch. Oh, let's just let this load here. We're not going to do both of these things at the same time, right? If you've already uploaded a custom projection, we're not going to touch it when we overwrite this. This will impact the other Dodgers on the team that don't have custom projections, right? So it could potentially be useful if you're uploading custom projections for only a subset of teams or something like that, where maybe I have custom projections for half of the teams on the slate and I want to use some team totals from there. You could do that, but you won't ever get anything out of using both at the same time, mostly because that custom projection is just going to lock those players in. We're not going to touch the projections from there, right? So great question again, Zach, there. I know kind of just a short one there, but one that is probably useful for other people to see, that those two things, you don't need to be doing both of those things. So using custom projections, you're pretty much good to go, right? So let's go ahead and see here. So then we had a question. I think we are now over into the Office Hours channel here. This one is from Andrew. I know Andrew got a couple questions today, but I'll go ahead and handle these in order. So Andrew asked, when doing single entry builds, the exposure for the players we get are always 100%. Is there a way to know how much exposure our pool of players is getting to a player? Going off Bundy example from yesterday, it would be helpful to know when Saber really likes someone. In 20 and 150 max lineups, you already have enough lineups to know the same info already. Yes, so this is a good topic to talk about. We've been talking about in a couple of the last Office Hours streams how you can view your entire pool and why it might be useful to do so. And we talked about it in particular around max exposure, but what we'll do is we'll talk for single entry today here. So I'm going to go ahead here. Let's edit some projections. Maybe I should have just left Walker where it was at. Let's see. So we'll edit those. So Andrew, your first note here, when doing single entry builds, the exposures we get for players are always 100%. I'm going to assume that is the reason you said that is because you are building just a single lineup where that would actually be the case, right? So if we build a single entry lineup, there's only one, all of our players in the pool are going to be 100% exposed, right? Because we only built one lineup. So you can see we've got our nice Dodgers over Pittsburgh stack here. There is a way to see what your entire pool of players looks like. And for a single entry build, the easiest way to do that would be to go up here and you can see we have one lineup, but we built 10, would be to just change this to 10. And what it is going to do is it's going to all of a sudden show you what you've got here. Let's see, one sec. Oh, actually, before I'm not going to delete this. I realized I had a max exposure setting set here because I was playing with this earlier. So I'm actually going to go ahead and put this back real quick to 100. So let's run another one here. Okay. So yeah, you can set this to 100 or to 10, right? and capture your entire pool. And now you can see here what really, the way I like to think about this is what SaberSim tried, right, for your single entry lineup. So you can see it built a lot of Houston, and now our top lineup's a little bit different. We got a lot of Houston. It tried out 7 different pitchers. Our top has Nola and Rodon, but we tried a bunch of different pitchers for our lineups, right? We have a pool of 7. And you can kind of start to see where SaberSim, I guess, felt like the flexibility was there, right? So in this particular case, pretty rigidly all in on the Astros, but definitely has some flexibility on the pitching pool surrounding them. So yeah, you can kind of get an idea on where, I don't know, where SaberSim thinks like the rub is with the lineups, right? Like it's pretty profoundly in favor of running a Houston stack out there for your single entry builds, but open to some flexibility for your pitchers. So that's the easiest way to see that. I will note, you mentioned here in 20 and 150 max, you have enough lineups to know the same info already. That is true in some ways, but you can actually do this for 20 maxes too, right? So we're talking 20 max, build 20 lineups. And I assume what you meant here is like, you can see since you have a pool of 20, if you're getting 100% Astro stacks here or something like that, you can kind of see. But you can actually, we'll let this build, you can actually look at the entire pool for your 20 maxes too, and get a broader idea too. So let's look at this here in a second. All right, cool. So you can see, right? Did that a little fast. So we go back, we're looking at our 20 lineups. So you can see we like Bieber quite a bit. Team stack, still a ton of Astros, right? Not that different from what we're getting in the single entries. But all of a sudden, if we want to look at the entire pool and just get familiar with what the full extent of our lineups look like, you can really start to see. This is useful, right? It paints a little bit of a picture where when we're only looking at 20 lineups and we have almost 100% Houston, it would imply to you that Houston's really the only viable stack. But you can see what's actually happening is that there's a lot of viable stacks here, thinking about our pool as a pool of viable lineups. But Houston just stands out as being so good at this point in the day, probably because the ownership numbers look pretty low, that our top 10%, or 20 of our 200, are all Houston stacks. But this should give you a little bit more confidence if you wanted to move away from Houston when you were going back down to your 20, right? You at least know there's a ton of other stacks in the pool. So we come back here, and maybe we're not willing to be 90% on Houston stacks, but we're willing to be 50%. We feel pretty confident about that because we know the total stacks that are in the entire pool is a pretty enormous list, right? So that's another useful thing to do where I'm going to try to not ramble and go on tangents today because we have a lot to get to. But if you are seeing that message that says something like you need to build more lineups to support this, it's a very good idea to just check and look what your pool looks like, right? So let's say we don't want to play Houston at all. We clearly can get away with that, right? There's so many stacks here. We could probably just say, okay, no Houston, and it's going to be totally fine, right? So it's going to pivot. It's all of a sudden going to get us on Dodgers, which is the next highest stack, which makes sense. But it's not going to show us a message saying we need to build more lineups. But if we reset this back and we looked at the entire pool again, and this said something like 90% Houston stacks of a pool of 200, right? It's not going to be as flexible if we just turn off the Houston. So very useful to look at your entire pool. We've been talking a lot about that. I think that's kind of been a recurring theme over the past week. Very, very useful one. So okay, let's keep us rolling here. Andrew, I've got another one of your questions here. We'll get right into this one now. If I'm playing to win GPPs, it seems like pitcher ownership fade should increase on smaller slates and decrease on bigger slates as ownership naturally disperses due to more options. Is that a fair statement? Is there a slate size you consider the middle? Andrew, I'm going to say, I mean, you're definitely on the right track here, right? Ownership is going to condense more on the smaller slates. Ownership numbers are just going to be higher, so we're kind of more interested in fading it. You can see that manifest itself here, where on a 15-game slate like today, for let's say a 20 max, 10,000 entry, something like this, the ownership fade is low. And if we go back to looking at yesterday, the ownership fade on our little 2-gamer, let's go back and look at it, was for the same size contest, moderate, right? Ownership fade is typically going to go up the smaller the slate. Chalk is worse a lot of times on smaller slates too. That's the other way to think about it, right? There's less players playing. We saw the Angels get spectacularly chalky yesterday. They turned out to score a lot of runs, but they were chalky purely because of a pool of 4 teams. They happen to have the highest run total. Were the Angels an objectively elite play? Were they a spectacular, better spot than anyone else? Probably not, but that's where the chalk went because it was the only option. On a 15-game slate like we have today, the chalk is going to get condensed around the best plays on the slate, right? And there are going to be some truly great plays on the slate, right? Like you can also think about it from the standpoint of pitching, right? Look at our pitching tonight. We've got Bieber and Glass now, 2 of the best in the game, but all these other really talented pitchers. If Bieber ends up being very chalky, having maybe arguably a top 3 pitcher in the whole league become chalky is harder to fade than the best point per dollar than Dylan Bundy, right? Exactly like we had yesterday. So that's part of the reason also that ownership will be lower for bigger slates. So we are actually in the middle of looking into this a little bit here on our end and the way we think about ownership and how ownership fade is calculated on the lineup builder side for smaller and larger slates. So this is something that we're continuing looking into optimizing further. But you nailed it. You're on the right track. You're thinking about it the right way, Andrew. In terms of, is there a slate size you consider the middle? I don't really know. I mean, like middle mathematically, like I feel like probably like an 8-game slate feels kind of middle groundy to me between the extreme of a 15-game slate. I mean, really on one end, we have 2-game slate, right? That's pretty much the smallest classic DFS size slate we're going to get. And a 15-game slate is the biggest. So, yeah, I would say like probably an 8 or 9-game slate feels like somewhat like a medium-sized slate to me. But yeah, the default sliders will probably in general kind of put you in the right spot with the way you're thinking about ownership fade. But is a very good transition to our next question that came in through Phantom. And I think there's kind of a lot of similarity between these two questions. And Phantom asked, now that we're back to a big MLB slate, fading the chalk stacks seems to be a pretty popular industry standard for GPPs. I'm curious if it's best to continue to rely on the current default ownership fade slider based on your contest setting and perhaps make stack exposure tweaks from there, or run the ownership fade slider to 0 and then adjust your stack exposures from there. This is a great question, Phantom. There's not a right or wrong way to do this. And I know there are a lot of players out there that, especially on bigger slates, do something similar to what you described here with your run the ownership fade slider to 0 and then adjust the stack exposures from there. So we just kind of saw, let's just see what that looks like. So we'll click manual mode. We'll turn ownership fade off and let's just kind of see what this looks like. This is totally fine to do this. In fact, I think it's actually a pretty good idea in general to just run this build every so often. This build being one where ownership fade is completely off. I think what you end up getting out of it, especially I know some of the folks on the SaberSim team have talked about before also running this build where smart diversity is turned all the way up. You essentially get a chance to look at and since ownership fade is low already tonight, we're not going to get very different stacks, but you essentially get an opportunity to look at an ownership agnostic build and get to see really a way of viewing all the lineups all the different stacks that might be viable for a slate like for a slate like tonight, right? We're looking if ownership was not even a concern for ourselves, just looking at correlation. So we want big stacks and just looking at smart diversity, right? So we want to build upside friendly lineups. What are the stacks that come out, right? So you can see it now. We see Houston, Milwaukee, Kansas City, the Angels. Again, not very different than what we got the first time we ran this with ownership fade on. But from here, you can then kind of start to think about where's the chalk going to end up. And obviously, the point of ownership fade as a slider is so that you don't have to do this sequentially, and you don't we're going to take care of this for you. But if you disagree with the ownership numbers that we have, for example, or think ownership is going to end up a little bit differently, or just want to handle it on your own and see, right, how good is the chalk, this is a fine way to do it. And especially, I think, on bigger slates too, where ownership fade is already going to be low, this is a really good approach. So I actually will do this sometimes in my process. One of the things I like to do is actually, before I've even run any other builds that day, is I will actually run my test build with ownership fade off. I will pull up that trusty dashboard that we've had up here already a couple times recently, and I will kind of, just to get an idea of what I think the slate's going to look like, right? And start going through this. And a lot of times, I've told you guys before, I'll make notes, but I like looking at teams that I think are projected to over 5 runs. So we have Dodgers, Phillies, we're just going real quick. Astros, right? And A's and Padres, right? So you can kind of see, if we then go back to our stacks, so we're getting a ton of Houston, but some of our next most popular stacks are actually Milwaukee and Kansas City and the Angels, which aren't teams that are projected for over 5 runs. So you can see, maybe, we're well over on Houston, which it looks like is very likely to be probably the most popular stack tonight. But even with an ownership fade at 0, we're starting to get some teams that on a 15-game slate are likely probably not to be in the very highest percentage of ownership, right? Milwaukee and Kansas City, we can see the way the public is in general feeling about those teams. Kansas City, right, is probably a very heavy leverage play at this play of the day, considering that the field does not seem to be very positive on them at all. Where's Milwaukee at? Did I miss them? I don't know. You guys get the idea. I don't know why I can't see them. I feel like I'm blind to the Brewers logo or something, but anyway. Oh, there they are. 4 runs, right? So these are teams that are probably going to be pretty low owned. And we're even getting some 5 stacks going on. Ownership fade at 0 here. It actually looks like probably what's happening. Yeah, so we're seeing a fair bit of Milwaukee here. Really what it looks like is happening is it's just slamming a ton of Houston 5 stacks and then giving some pretty unlikely stacks alongside that. So we can start doing the same thing with pitching. So maybe this can kind of guide a little bit how high you need that ownership fade slider to even be. Maybe if you feel like we're by default with ownership fade off, we're getting away from some of the chalkier plays. Maybe you can kind of decide from there where you want your ownership fade slider to be. So I would say this is what I would feel as a little bit more of an intermediate to advanced SaberSim strategy. If you are not very comfortable with looking at the slate and getting an idea of where ownership is going to end up, that is totally fine. If you don't feel comfortable as much knowing about the right amount of chalk to fade and to play in your lineups, if you were still kind of getting familiar with where some of these slider settings should be, I would say don't worry about this too much. Let the ownership fade slider just sit where it wants to sit. And go from there. But if you kind of want to take another step here in terms of really tweaking and moving around your lineups, I think this can be a really interesting place to go. I will say one more thing I like to look at, and actually when I'm doing this myself, what I commonly do is for my ownership fade build, when I turn ownership fade all the way off, I will turn smart diversity all the way up. Again, this isn't a build that I would personally be just building and then entering these lineups, but for just the purpose of viewing, I like to run the build this way. And what that's going to do is it's going to just open up that pool a little bit more, right? So it gives you a little bit more vision into all the viable paths to a high upside lineup that night, instead of having a little bit of a lower smart diversity. So not super important to see the results of this build, but we'll see what happens, I guess, just so I can show you. So we saw a lot of Houston, right, the first time, and we had a moderate smart diversity at 4. This will spread us out a little bit more, or not. Just love Houston right now. But our pitching pool did spread out pretty significantly because our smart diversity is so high, right? So anyway, Phantom, great question there. There's just a really good question. And I've been wanting to talk about that a little bit, about kind of what you can get out of running those zero ownership fade builds. So I guess just in summary there, I would say, there's nothing wrong with, and it's probably a good starting point to just continue to rely on the default sliders for ownership fade. But as you're getting more familiar with kind of the product and what ownership fade is doing, or just even to learn more about what ownership fade is doing, try turning it off sometimes for certain slates. Turn your smart diversity up and just see what the builder believes are the high upside lineups, the well-constructed high upside lineups for that sport that night. Compare that to what your understanding of where you think the chalk is going to be on the slate, and then see where you think leverage needs to be applied, right? So, I mean, that's the best way I could put it, right? Like what SaberSim wants to do is it wants to have a spread out player pool right now and then play a ton of Astros. Astros are going to be super popular tonight. So you need to build lineups then that provide some leverage elsewhere in the lineup. And that's where you can either, maybe you want to cap exposure to some Astros. Maybe you want to make sure you're incorporating some off stacks that aren't so chalky, or maybe you want to get different on pitching. And maybe to get there, you turn your ownership fade back up to the default. Maybe you turn it up to double the default. Maybe you just edit exposures instead. So lots of options there. Great question. Really enjoyed talking through that a little bit. So let me know if anyone has any questions about that. And I will keep us rolling right now because we still have plenty of questions in our queue. So another really solid question here from Bornagal. I think that's probably how you pronounce that. Let me know if it isn't. This also came through Slack, and he said, if you're playing 10 different single entry GPPs, is the optimal strategy to use the same lineup or 10 different lineups? This is going to depend really on your risk tolerance, Bornagal, and isn't really necessarily limited to just those options, right? You could play 5 total single entry contests, or you could play 5 total single entry lineups and give each one 2 contests. You could play 2 single entry lineups and put them each into 5 different contests. There are a handful of things that come into play here. I would say the more lineups you build to fill your contest, the more spread out you are going to be, but the lower your overall ceiling that night is going to be, right? So if you are building 10 lineups, you only need 1 to win. But if 1 wins, it's presumable unless they are all very close that the other 9 lose. Vice versa, if you build a single lineup and enter it into all 10 of your contests, if it wins that lineup, it's probably going to win or top 5 or top 10 in pretty much every contest, and your ceiling is going to be massive. I would say if you are playing with a relatively small or modest sized bankroll, right? I think what I would probably recommend, and what I do myself, is spreading out and playing 10 different lineups, right? So I would go in and I would set my single entry contests and I would tell it to build 10. And I would do it this way. And, oh, did it run? And I would allow those, yeah, it's running right now. I would allow those to be played in a bunch of different contests, right? I am not so concerned with winning everything on a night. I'm mostly concerned with winning with one lineup. I would say it really, in terms of my recommendation is, I would probably only start to spread. I would start to like stack up volume on one lineup only once I got to the point where I felt like I couldn't build so many lineups on the slate that were profitable, right? Like if you feel like you are, and with single entry, it's hard to get to that point, but let's say you're playing a bunch of single entry and also some 150 maxes and some 20 maxes and some 3 maxes, and maybe you have 1,000 entries on a single slate, right? you're going to reach a point where there's probably not 1,000 profitable lineups you can build. At that point, maybe you are really spreading out your risk on your 150 maxes, right? You're getting a lot of exposure to a lot of different guys, but your single entries have kind of condensed, and maybe across 20 different single entry contests, you're really only playing like one lineup or two lineups or three lineups. But that's kind of what I would think about here. I would ask yourself, this question does come up a lot, and I think really a good way to think about it is, would it be more frustrating for you to have to win in a single entry contest that ended up being your lowest dollar contest, right? So let's say you play the $1 single entry, the $2, the $3, the $5, the 10, and the 25, right? And if all of those contests have different lineups in it, it's entirely possible that you just win the $1 single entry contest that night. That's a win. That's an awesome ROI for you. But to some people, that would be frustrating, that basically by pure luck, their best lineup was in the lowest dollar contest. Vice versa, if you use the same lineup in every single contest, you can just lose every contest that night. All of your entries fail to cash. So you can kind of see a little bit there, right, where the upside is capped by spreading out and the floor is lowered, or the risk is higher by condensing. So that's really the way to think about it. I would ask yourself, am I a little bit more risk averse, or am I shooting for upside, and decide what you want to do. Hopefully that answers your question. That one does come up a lot. I had mentioned too, I think in a comment then, Born a Goal here had said, similarly, if you're playing three max GPPs, should you play 9 lineups or the same 3 in each game? This line of thinking can be extended pretty much as high as you want to go, right? Should I say you're playing, I made a joke, 150 max GPPs, but no, say you're playing like 2 150 maxes, right? I know there's some folks out there that play the 50 cent and the $1 mini max every night, and that's 300 lineups. Should that be 300 unique, or 150, right? The question there still is, do you want to be condensed around your pool of lineup, or do you want to spread out? Do you want to have more lineups built? When you get to the point where you're talking about this for 150 lineups, I would definitely ask yourself, am I building 150 lineups or am I building 300 lineups that are all profitable that I want to play, right? And you can see that too. Let's actually just go ahead and hop back to the app here and say that you're a bigger MME player, right? And you're playing stuff like the Minimax, and you need 300 lineups, and you want to get an idea on whether or not you can build 300 profitable lineups. A good way to do that, and this will take a second to build, but a good way to do that is just run it through the builder, have it build this many lineups, and take a look at what some of those lineups at the end of the pool look like. I think on a 15-game slate, you probably can build 300, 400 or 500 profitable lineups, to be completely honest. But yesterday on our 2-game slate, would it have been profitable to build 300 lineups, max both of the mini maxes on a 2-game slate? I don't know. We probably would need to go build it and look and see if the lineups at the end of that 300 lineup pool look good, look profitable. What's the Saber score compared to the 100 standardized Saber score? So a lot of different things to consider there. But very general terms here speaking, right? If you are shooting for upside and you want to win everything, when your single entry lineup is built the right way, enter it into every contest. If you want to spread out, cap your upside a little bit, because you can't necessarily control which lineup's gonna, or which contest, actually both, which lineup or contest you're gonna win. But you want to raise the overall floor of your entire investment that night. Spread out. And this is a bankroll question too, right? Are you playing 5% of your bankroll, which is pretty much the max we recommend anyone to play on a slate, like the maximum do not exceed? That might be something maybe you want to spread out a little bit more. But if you're playing 1% of your bankroll or something like that, on a slate like that, you are less invested to that slate overall. You can maybe afford for all those lineups to fail, and maybe in that case you're condensing a little bit. But since we're close here, I will let this build finish. I will make my point I wanted to make about looking at these lineups, and then we will move on, right? So in this case, we're exploring whether or not you can build 300 profitable lineups, right? And the easiest way to do that, at least as a starting point, is to just come to these lineups here at the end. So we're seeing like the last handful of lineups. We standardize all of the lineups in the pool to a Saber score of 100, right? So the first lineup has a 100 Saber score. The last one has a 90 Saber score. So that looks pretty good to me. Then it's going to be really like a personal question of looking at some of the stacks you're getting at some of these end of these lineups. Like, do you want to play Yankee stacks? Do you want Seattle stacks? Right, that would be a way of doing that here. But I understand that really wasn't exactly what the original question was about, so I won't stay too long on that, and we will move us along. Okay. Actually, this is a great point here. This question also came in through Andrew on Slack here, and I will answer this one quickly because it's a quick question. So I did see this question last week, Andrew. I'm sorry I missed it. I had not answered it yet. How do you view your build parameters on a build from yesterday? The only thing shown on the build screen is style, entry limit, and entries. Is there a workaround, or am I missing something? And I think Safo or Safo, I'm not sure how you pronounce that, answered this already, stole my thunder here a little bit, but you can hover this and it's going to tell you exactly what sliders you used for that build. So you can see it'll tell you the style, the entry limit, the entries you had, but if you hover, you'll actually see the individual slider settings. You can't very easily see some of the other build settings you had here, like min max salary, max exposure, that kind of thing. But what you can do, sometimes I am curious on what those settings look like on a build that just ran. If you just click new build, I believe this is always just going to show you the settings you used for the very last build. So you can see, actually, I had max exposure here set at 20 again, which I don't know why. I don't know why I did that, but I did, apparently. So that's like useful to go back and see, right? If you had a question about where some of your settings were, you can see on the very previous build where those things are. So all right, I'm going to take a breath here. I have been talking nonstop for about 42 minutes. I start getting sweaty on these shows sometimes. It's getting hot outside. My condo's starting to heat up on me a little bit here. Got to slow down. Getting a little too excited about DFS here. I start sweating on stream. Let's see here. So I have some other questions. Weekend Warrior asked, is there a way to exactly change entries? Max 150 change to 70. There is, I'm going to answer this in what I kind of think you're asking me, Weekend Warrior, here. So let's say we are playing a 150 max tournament, right? Something like the mini max, but we're only playing 70 entries in the lineup. So, I mean, what you can obviously do is just request less lineups, change this to 70. If the question is like, what should my sliders then be if I'm only playing 70 in the 150 max? We always recommend that you keep these true to what the actual contest you are playing in is, right? Other folks in this contest have 150 lineups, which means they are going to take more shots on lower owned plays. They're going to play higher upside plays because they have 150 lineups to do so. So even though you are only playing 70, we recommend that you keep the sliders true to that contest type, right? So this is kind of how I would set that up, at least as a starting point. I would say if your question is actually instead about a 70 max contest, right, which we also get those questions sometimes. I think DraftKings is very consistent with like single entry, 3 max, 20 max, 150 max, but I know FanDuel gets pretty all over the place and has quite a few different maxes. If you are playing something that is actually a true 70 max contest, what I like to do is take a look at what the sliders look like for the two closest contests around it. So maybe for a 20 max, you're at 836. For a 150 max, you're at 838. Maybe you use manual mode to go 837, find somewhere in the middle and build your lineups like that. So let me know if that answers your question. Weekend Warrior might have slightly misunderstood that, so just let me know. All right, cool. Let me see. I've got a couple other questions that came up. So we did get a question From, let me see here. We got a couple questions from Chance on Twitter here about these sliders, and I think his question was really kind of getting at, the question was phrased, what are the optimal sliders for this contest? Right? Should I be moving around the defaults? And I see this question come up sometimes in Slack, especially folks that are still just getting familiar with the product. And I think partially because this step 2 here is probably the most intuitive at first glance part of your process. It's very easy for some of our users to start their first build on SaberSim and latch on to the slider settings and say, okay, this is where I make the money, right? And that's not exactly how we want people to think about it. And that's not exactly how I think people that are getting the most value out of SaberSim are doing so. So if you have general questions about how to use the sliders, I highly recommend you start with the defaults, right? Especially as you are getting familiar. I think the most value that any one user can add is going to be more on step 1, where you are picking your inputs and providing your vision of the slate, right? That's the way I like to think about it, right? This is our predicted set of outcomes that we think is going to happen on the slate, both in terms of what the baseball teams are going to do and what the field is going to do. And we've talked a ton about how to do that. I am happy to always talk about more. This is going to give you your framework for how you're going to build lineups as a response to that, right? And this is something where I feel like you can, we talked about some advanced strategies here with turning down ownership fade and turning smart diversity up as a tool to learn more about the slate. But in terms of actually building your lineups, this is probably what I would worry about the least in terms of adding value, right? There's nothing wrong with tweaking this. In fact, it's very good to move these sliders around, run some test builds, see what happens. But in terms of adding value to your process, I would say this is probably the least amount of time that you really need to be spending here, because the optimal default sliders are already in a good spot. And then finally, right, the third step is really your quality control is what we call it. And it's your opportunity to really manage your risk in a lot of ways, and how spread out you want to be. So we've talked about, right, viewing your entire pool, getting an idea of what the pool looks like. Everything that happens here on step 3 is a way for you to manage your pool of viable lineups that you've created. And what we do. Oh, also, I meant to mention this. I don't know, Kurt, if you're watching. I already reached out to you in support, but we did fix this max exposure issue. So for whatever reason, I happened to build this. I was messing with this beforehand. Before I got on here, so I must have just had 20 max exposure on or something. But you can see this is working really nicely now. So this actually now, because I had that setting on, isn't the most useful build. But let me see if one of these other builds I can talk about. Everything, I guess the larger point I'm trying to make here is everything you're doing on step 3 is really just a way of sorting and managing and selecting lineups out of your pool of viable lineups that aligns with your risk portfolio for the slate, right? Like you could, it's up to you how risky you want to be. You could say, I don't want to play any stack more than one lineup a piece, right? And manage it that way and be super spread out. You can sort your lineups by projected score. And we have that up here once this loads, and just say, I want to play the highest mean projected lineups all in this step 3. You could say, I only want to play one stack. I don't care what it is. Give me SaberSim's favorite stack, and I'm playing every lineup with that stack, right? This is your quality control stage. So you have so much control over what happens with your lineups in step 1 and step 3 that I would not overly sweat what your sliders look like in step 2, because the default sliders are going to give you a very good start. And it's just not a place where a lot of value is added. And there's not like a magic slider set beyond maybe what we have as the defaults that is out there and winning all the money, right? So Wanted to talk a little bit about that. I know that question comes up a lot, especially new users, right? They come in and say, where should I set these sliders, right? So, all right, cool. And then we had one other question that also came in from Chance on Twitter, and he was really asking about the profitability long-term of 20 max and 150 max contests, right? I think he specifically asked, hey, I'm playing a lot of 150 max. Are these profitable? Are these the right contests to play? And Chance, if you're watching either live here or as a recording, you're already on the right track for asking that question. If you're thinking about contest selection, you are ahead of the field in terms of what a lot of the other folks playing DFS are doing. I will plug once again our SaberSim How to Build a Winning DFS MLB DFS Process course that is under resources on our site, SaberSim.com, under strategy, and then under baseball here, course, build a winning MLB DFS process. Andy put this course together. It is fantastic. The first big lesson here is bankroll management and contest selection. It is 22 minutes of Andy talking about the best way to optimize your contests. It says it right here, right? To grow your bankroll as fast as possible. And he goes into more detail than I'm going to be able to go to here in the next 10 minutes. But contest selection is huge. And I will say, let me think about my Spark Notes version of this, right? Prioritize contests that are under $3 because players with $1 million of lifetime winnings or more can't play those contests, right? Second, play contests that have over 1,000 effective entrants first. So effective entrants is the number of total entries in the contest divided by the lineup maximum for any one player. And that is the biggest thing where you're going to see where those 150 maxes and 20 maxes start looking a lot less profitable, right? Those are still contests that you'll need to add to your portfolio eventually to get enough action, but you should be playing probably quite a few single and 3 entry contests first because they're going to be a little bit softer fields to win, right? Then from there, you can start adding in some of those 20 and 150 maxes. Go and watch this video, please. If you haven't seen it already, it is fantastic. Watch the rest of the course as well, but this is a really good video. Andy dives in a little bit more into detail about why those are the best contests to play. And I would say, again, short answer is that selectively, yes. I mean, you can obviously win at the 20 max and 150 max contests long-term. There are plenty of folks that do it. SaberSim is going to get you further than almost any traditional optimizer will with our lineup builds that account for correlation and ownership and upside in the form of smart diversity compared to other optimizers, but they can be hard and they can be pretty sharp. So go watch that video. I'm going to keep us moving here because I see some other questions came in and we are getting close to the end. All right. Let me see here. Okay. Jonathan Liu asked, hey, really appreciate the tips on MLB. Would you have time at the end to briefly go MVA over NBA, especially Showdown on FanDuel? Jonathan, first off, if you have not seen our NBA strategy session from last week, you have got to check it out. It is up on our YouTube channel. It was me, Andy, Max, and Danny talking for over an hour on NBA short slate and Showdown strategy. We had a blast with it. We've heard some good feedback. There's a ton of interesting information in there. I highly recommend you go and check that out because it is a full hour here and I've got 6.5 minutes. So there's just going to be way more information for you there to talk about, but I am happy to bring up our MBA here and talk a little bit about this. I will say, let's go ahead and look at this. So we were looking at single game contests. Okay, I'm going to start here. And I'm going to say something maybe you don't want to hear, but I don't totally like these contests. I don't think FanDuel has a very good single game slate format because they do not scale their salaries of their players on their multiplier positions. So I think NBA is a little bit better because they have this 1.2x multiplier player, 1.5 or 2x or however this ends up working. But because they do not scale salaries here per position, it is really to everyone's benefit to play the highest projected players at the highest multiplier values, which I think just ultimately leads to a situation where everyone is losing to the rake. I don't know if FanDuel's NBA Showdown product is that beatable, to be completely honest. On DraftKings, you'll see, I think NBA Showdown still can be very difficult to win. The edge is a lot smaller, but on DraftKings, even though there is only one captain spot, one multiplier position, salaries are scaled to play that captain position. So you have decision matrices of playing either a value play versus a okay, hang on. Jonathan said, I have a pretty specific question. Slates where there are 3 obvious stars to play, is it profitable to only enter rosters containing all 3 players? I would say probably on FanDuel, yes. Like, that's the way I think about it. Since they're not charging you more to use multipliers, I think the most optimal way to build the lineup is probably to take the players that have the highest projection, especially in maybe in terms of like a salary band, right? Like I think, for example, on this particular slate, Joel Embiid is so highly projected over every other player here. It's hard for me to imagine a lineup that I would want to build that had anything other than Embiid at MVP, and so on. So I think if there's 3 obvious stars to play, right? Yeah, I would say your optimal lineup construction is almost certainly to just play the best players at the multiplier positions. I'm curious, like, what actually happens. So yeah, okay, right here, follow up. Like in Mavs versus Clippers for Game 7, I entered like 10 rosters, and all 10 as Luka as MVP, Kawhi as star, and Paul George as pro. And I think, yeah, that's what I wanted to test here. I think that's pretty much optimal. Again, it's all because since FanDuel is not charging you to use a multiplier in terms of lineup salary, there's not really a lot of other lineup constructions that are viable. And then let's see, Jonathan, you said there seems to be an edge playing the 3 best players and then test every combination of utils that makes some sense. I think you're playing this in a sharp way, to be completely honest. I think your best bet, so you can see, like, really there's only a handful of constructions here that we think are very valid. And I would even probably say from here, I might even limit my lineup constructions more than this. But yeah, no, I think the edge in this contest, if there is to be one, is by taking advantage of people that don't do this, that are taking really random shots at their multiplier positions, because it's just not going to pay off very often, right? And that's true I know for football too. FanDuel has a similar setup. In FanDuel, again, since the prices don't change per position, what you're really doing is your multiplier positions need to be the highest ceiling players. On DraftKings, since the multiplier position does have a higher salary, the captain position, in a way, you almost need to think about it more as this like value weighted ceiling. So it opens up 4 options, but yeah, exactly. Let other people get creative and watch them lose. Yeah, it sounds good. And I haven't played FanDuel single game in some time, so I don't know what kind of constructions people are probably doing. I know NBA Showdown is just a little bit interesting because it's not a contest that is the easiest thing to win on its own, especially like during the regular season. But in playoffs, you've got so many people that are just clicking players, sitting at the bar and sitting on their couch that aren't maybe DFS players. Those contests are freaking huge. So I'm sure that they're a little more beatable than they normally are. So, but yeah, hopefully that helped. I will say again, if you haven't watched that strategy session though, I highly recommend checking it out because we talk a lot more strategy in that video. But great questions, and I think you're on the right track in terms of the way you're attacking these. So. All right, let's see here. Coming up close to the end here. I don't see any other questions. Not sure I've got enough time to answer anything anyway. You guys made this a great office hours today. Thank you so much. Probably some of the highest engagement we've had throughout the show. So thank you so much for some of these back and forth questions. Everybody that was watching here, thank you so much for filling me up and getting me so many questions before the show started anyway. Woke up and hopped online and I saw all these questions coming in. I got pretty excited for the show here. We will be back again tomorrow, 2 p.m. Eastern time, talking more strategy. We'll keep it going. And then on Thursday, again, 2 p.m. Eastern, we're hoping to do an esports themed strategy session. So once that is kind of set into stone here and we've got this all set up on our end, I'll reach out to the Slack community and everyone and start getting some of your questions. That's been successful in the past 2 weeks here where we'll get some questions ahead of time so we know what you guys are interested in. But look forward to that. And we will go from there. So thanks again, everyone, for tuning in live. And if you are watching this recording later, thank you too. Let me know if there are any other questions. Support@SaberSim.com. You've heard it all before. We'll be back again tomorrow, 2 p.m. Eastern. Thank you guys so much. Take care.